What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the One More Rep podcast. You guys are checking this out on YouTube, so please do me a favor and subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave me a comment, send the video around, share it with a friend, ring the bell. That way you're notified every time I drop a new episode. And yeah, so another Q&A episode coming at you guys. I am taking these questions from my Instagram. The link for my Instagram will be below in the description box. The link to my website where I offer online coaching will be in the description below. And the link to the Muscle Media Network where I hosted another podcast previously with Tommy Styles, that will be below as well. Jumping right into it, someone asks, in an off-season push when food is high and you can't get it down, should you switch foods or pull back? I would say in this situation that I'm coaching someone, um, my coaching varies depending on the person and their psychology, what phase they're in, whether they're in an off season or a prep. Um, and so, I have any number of clients that are on like a set meal plan. And that's because they've said flat out, like, hey, just tell me what to eat, tell me when to eat it, and I'll follow it. Some people have more macro plans. Now, with that, I will usually include like a food list. So, it's not if it fits your macros with, Pop Tarts and ice cream and bullshit. It's, the intended plan is to have some flexibility within what bodybuilding foods you use. So with all that said, if someone is on a macro plan and I don't have total visibility to the food sources they're using, that's going to be the first thing that I ask them. Like, okay, what are you eating? If we're, you know, um, for example, if I'm working with like a male enhanced bodybuilder or just a male bodybuilder looking to put on size or eating a pretty significant amount of food, and I don't have the visibility to all the food sources that they're using, I'm going to ask them to track a couple days worth of foods or write out um, what exactly they ate for a couple days. Ask them to be a little bit more mindful of their feedback to each food source or meal, um, and then just try to um, quote unquote optimize it where you can, with the obvious ones. So, if we're starting to eat a lot of food, the person struggling to get it all down, I'm gonna look to favor more simple carbs or carbs that are not going to be high in fiber. So if somebody's doing oats, somebody's doing potatoes, um, any of these things that might be really beneficial in a diet because of the fiber and because of the slower digestion, I'm going to look to get those out when someone's struggling to get the food volume in that they need to get in. So, more white rice, cream of rice, rice products in general are going to be good. Um, Even sometimes things like cereals, like as a post-workout meal, can be good. I don't really mind as long as someone hasn't shown or reported any type of intolerance to gluten. I think bagels or English muffins are fine. Um, at a certain point, things like pastas, I think can be fine as well. So it just depends on that person, what they can enjoy. A big part of just being able to get a lot of food down is that you need to enjoy the food and kind of you should be looking forward to your meals. So if that's not the case, definitely food sources need to change. Now, if I'm working with someone and it's a set meal plan, I've already done those things for them. So if they do get to a point where it's they're reporting that they just can't get the food down, uh part of part of what will go into it mentally, um from my perspective, is how well do I know this person, how well do I know their psychology, how long have they been working with me to where I know kind of what their thresholds are for discomfort and kind of how far they're willing to push themselves because it's not always going to be easy under no circumstance. So um, I would say in a situation where I've worked with someone for a while, they are usually pretty I would say, if it's someone that's not so quick to um, report negative feedback and like it's someone that can usually power through things, and now they're just reporting that they're flat out at a wall, then that would be a good time to pull back. And then I would say, hearing or seeing that that was the feedback, it might be a good time to go get blood work done. Even if you're in the middle of a cycle and you still have runway left in terms of like body fat and time on gear, I would go get your blood work done to get an idea of where your thyroid is, where estrogen is, where A1C and insulin serum are. Um, and then that will give you an idea of kind of how long you need to pull back. It might only need to be a couple weeks. Maybe A1C is okay, and it's more of just um, an appetite issue. So maybe you pull back for a couple weeks, maybe you move more in terms of cardio, steps, things like that. Kind of an unorthodox idea in this situation, but in terms of moving more, creating more output or demand for food, I think sometimes as long as like recovery is good, this can be a place to add more volume and almost create more demand for food. So, yeah, I think it just depends. And if you have a coach or you are a coach and you have a client that's in this situation, it just takes some troubleshooting and some communication with the client to kind of weed out what the next best step would be. How would you set up a split if back and biceps need to come up the most? Um, I would say right off the bat, I would make sure that they're trained separately. Um, I think a lot of people, I've talked about this pretty frequently because this was the case for me personally. But I think a lot of guys are doing push-pull legs or some type of upper lower where there's several body parts being trained all in one session. And in that situation, if your arms are kind of falling behind or you're not happy with them and you're doing push pull legs, for example, so your pull days are like a full back and trap workout. Maybe you're doing rear delts too, and then you do biceps all the way at the end. If that setup has not delivered the results that you want for your biceps, something needs to change. Um, and I could go either way with this. I would think that an arm day would be a decent idea, but I also think just quite a bit of frequency and volume spread out over several days would be a good option as well. Um, so I'm not going to necessarily deliver just a set in stone um, split here, but I think a lot of times when guys complain about not getting the results with their arms that they'd like, it's because they're not treating it like a priority or they haven't treated it like a priority. So that one way or another, something needs to change and your split needs to reflect that arms are a priority. And with back, I would say a lot of times, man, I just see that execution and having an idea of what am I actually training with back now. I don't want to make people like overthink and try to over isolate, but you should absolutely be separating your movements on back day in terms of training upper back, where your scapulas retract as far, your elbows and scapulas get as far behind, as far behind or beyond your torso as you can. And that would be training your upper back. And then, having separate movements with a tucked elbow A little bit shorter range of motion at the bottom where you're just driving your elbow right to your hip, and that would be for lats. So separate your movements in terms of what am I training here? Um, and I think spending more time under tension is another thing that I see that people could do better for back. For whatever reason, it just seems like people really like rip and power through, which if that has built the back that you want, then great, don't change anything. But if you're complaining that your back isn't where you want it to be and that's how you usually train, you may want to just slow things down and be a little bit more deliberate. I've also found personally, um, depending on how much hinge work you're doing, like any type of deadlift variation, RDLs, rack pulls, if you have any of these things in, um, it may limit it some, but it does seem like your back can handle quite a bit of volume, especially if you're not someone that's super advanced and super strong and accurate with your training. So like if you're kind of in that intermediate level, there was several years kind of in the middle of my bodybuilding journey where my back came up quite a bit because I trained it twice a week. So I think that could probably be an option for most people. Um, and it's not always necessarily super indicative of a good workout, but I think if you're not getting sore at all from your back training, which I think a lot of guys, I hear that from, a lot of guys reporting that, then you probably can handle more volume because whatever you're doing might not be creating enough stimulus to create like uh the growth that you're looking for. Hmm. What do you think of GDAs? I think they have their place as long as you understand or have the right expectation about them. I think berberine can be good. I think depending on your growth hormone use and whether or not it has ever caused you any type of digestive issues, I think metformin can be good. Um, right now, I'm actually using a combination of both. I'm using 500 milligrams of metformin before bed, and I'm using 500 milligrams of berberine 3 times a day with carb meals. Um, Now, is it going to create an insulin-like response, or is it going to be a game changer in terms of, you know, immediate recomposition of your physique or any of these things? Probably not, but I think in the long term, it does add up to helping to manage your blood sugar, and I think you'll see improved A1C levels over the long term using either or of these. And that goes especially for guys that are uh, using a good bit of growth hormone to help them grow. So I think they have their place, but keep in mind that they're probably not going to be any type of game changer. During an off-season bulk, how much of your food should be junk food versus clean? Oh man, this is gonna this is gonna be pretty person and situation dependent. I've had long stretches of off-season bodybuilding where I had no cheat meals. Um, I've had long stretches of off-season bodybuilding where I did 3 cheat meals a week, and it wasn't particularly tightly monitored. Um, or even like a couple cheat meals a week, and if I wanted something extra on top of my food, I would do that. For me personally, that last style that I described ended up with me being pretty fat, and I think that would be most people. Um, but it also depends on how big and advanced you are, how much muscle are you carrying, how hard do you train. and how much food have you built your metabolism up to be able to handle. So if you're a bigger guy carrying a good amount of muscle, you're training hard, you're growing in the off season, and you've built like your baseline diet up to 6,000 calories a day, um, you have the room to be a little bit more flexible with it, because at that point you're a metabolic machine. Like, we know that muscle tissue is the most metabolically demanding tissue on the body. So if you just have a ton of muscle and you've already taught your body to put down tons and tons of food every single day. Man, in situations like that, I've been in situations like that, recently, and you almost find in those situations that, if you like replace a meal from your diet with a cheat meal out, um, a lot of times you almost end up under eating, compared to what like your set calories would be. Um, Now, I don't think that it should be whatever it is. I think you should have some type of system in place. So, especially if you're like a beginner or an intermediate, someone that's still got a little bit of baby fat on them, you're not like one of these guys that even in the off season, you keep a good set of abs and you stay pretty lean, just because you have so much muscle. If that's not you, I think that you should have some type of set system in place where it's like, hey, every Friday night I go out and have a cheat meal with my significant other. Um, I do it as a last meal, and it's usually like an entree, a side, and a modest dessert. So, I wouldn't necessarily like go to Cheesecake Factory and put a 5,000 calorie meal down on top of your full day of eating, because you are just not creating that demand for food, and it's going to end up in an excess amount of food to where you start getting softer than you want. So, I'm not going to put like a number on this, how much of your food should be junk food versus clean. If bodybuilding is the goal, like competitive bodybuilding, you're being as like lean and muscular as possible. Um, I can't really rationalize like the people that I know that those are their goals, they have a plan in place. It's not just going to be like I'm winging it during the week and having a cheat meal or off-plan food whenever I want. There should be some type of off-plan food. I think the best, most, or the not the best, but the most common system that works for most people, beginner, intermediate levels, is just a cheat meal a week. Go out, have a meal. Don't glorify it. Don't turn it into a binge. But on the flip side, I've talked about like doing long stretches of off-season bodybuilding where I was overly strict, and I don't think it made me a better bodybuilder in the long term. I don't think it needs to be overly thought out. Like, go out, have your one meal, have a burger and fries with a piece of cake or something, and then, you know, lock it in the rest of the week. How much cardio do you recommend in the off season? I think tracking steps, um, is a good standard, like on an everyday basis. Um, getting some type of minimum in 6,000, 7,000. I don't think it needs to be a crazy number in the off season. Um, just so that there's some type of standard. Excuse me. Um, so I think if you do something like that, 6 or 7,000 steps a day, and then actual machine cardio 3 or 4 times a week, um, and then the duration would be dependent on how intense the cardio is. I've had off-season bodybuilders, do 3 or 4 sessions of hit cardio where they're only 12 minutes because the intensity is really high. Now, if it's someone that maybe struggles to build their legs, or legs are a big priority, um, you know, I think in that situation, it's probably better to do something like 3 or 4 times a week at like a moderate pace for 20 to 25 minutes. How to choose the best macro split for post-show nutrition and optimizing insulin sensitivity. So I think post-show, I think it's again, it's very individual, but I think that your insulin sensitivity should be awesome. Like if you were really in contest shape, your insulin sensitivity should be awesome. And then it's more so just about adherence and not necessarily this individual macro split. Like if you end up having like multiple binges a week, obviously that has nothing to do with, how you chose to split up your on-plan macros. And the reason that you blew your insulin sensitivity is because you just weren't adherent to any type of plan. With that said, I think the body is pretty ripe to want to store fat in that post-show phase, especially the first, like, let's say 3 or 4 weeks. So I think, just your typical higher carb, high protein, like moderate added fats, um, is probably going to be best for most guys that are training with their physique and performance in mind. Um, it also is going to depend, I think, on how like hormonally tanked you are from the prep. Did you just do the final 6 weeks, with zero fats, and you're just buried, like from a hormonal sex drive standpoint, then you're going to want to get some added fats in for sure pretty quickly. And then in that case, your initial kind of first few weeks of carb intake might be more modest. Then there's got to be a little bit of a trade-off. I think it also depends on what are you doing with PEDs. So if you continue on in a blast, your ability to partition food is going to be higher. So you can probably get away with a little bit more of both. Obviously, you're going to want to keep cardio in. So it's a multifaceted answer, but I think, for the most part, a general recommendation would be higher protein to help satiate you. Um, you can get some fats from like your animal proteins, but I would do higher protein, higher carb, moderate added fats. In off season, where would you not put in cardio? Um, going back to the previous answer about cardio, I think if you're doing something like 3 or 4 times a week, that should leave you plenty of room to manipulate your week to where you don't do any on leg day. Um, in the off season, how much of a difference does this make for recovery? Probably not a ton, but I think it's always going to be best to separate your cardio if you can. And in the off season, I firmly believe in contest prep. I should say that, fasted cardio does make a difference, especially for the enhanced bodybuilder. But in the off season, if separating your cardio means, that you do it late at night or after, a meal or two after you're done training, I think that's totally fine. I think in the off season or lifestyle, it's more just about doing the cardio. So I would try to avoid doing it around your leg days, on your leg days. And then other than that, I don't think it makes a huge difference. I think post-workout cardio in the off season is totally fine as well, given that it's not like post legs. Um, and I would say probably if you're doing like a big pull day, big back with RDLs, type workout, I would probably just go home after your training. And if you are going to do cardio that day, I would separate it from the weight training. When going to a TRT cruise dose in terms of anabolics, would you generally keep GH at the same dose or lower that as well? Again, it depends. If we're talking about someone that's pretty generally healthy and they are trying to pursue competitive bodybuilding at the highest level, like they are all in on competitive bodybuilding, it's their life. Budget is not a consideration, even. Um, some people might disagree with this, but there is part of it like um, I've heard some people say that something like this would be reckless, but you have to keep in mind as a coach, like I work for each of my individual clients. So, they are kind of guiding the ship in terms of the general direction and what their risk tolerance is. And at the end of the day, I'm a bodybuilding coach that is paid to deliver results. So again, if someone is like trying to pursue bodybuilding, competitive bodybuilding at the highest level to be as big, muscular, lean, and competitive as they possibly can, more and more I've leaned towards bringing gear in terms of anabolics way down to like a true um, cruise or TRT where it might only be 200 or 250 milligrams of test. But if you were using 6 or 8 IUs of growth during your blast, I'm just going to leave it. Like if you can afford it and that's your risk tolerance. I've seen guys not only do an excellent job of holding where they are during the cruise, but even growing and kind of recomping a little bit. I think you can bring your food down a touch um, during a cruise and see like a really good recomp effect where you don't really lose any of the fullness. Um, and again, that's just one way to do it. If budget is an issue, if you take your bloods at the end of the cycle and your A1C is through the roof, then these are things where I would probably bring growth down or out completely. Thoughts on doing Deca as a base without testosterone? I think that's retarded. I would never do that. Is it possible to add muscle mass while we are holding a body fat percentage more than 15? It is. I think that we've seen studies with like sumo wrestlers where you do continue to build muscle, like the mechanism of building new muscle tissue doesn't just stop because you hit a certain level of body fat. Now I've seen it described as something called the P ratio, which is like basically just partitioning ratio. As you get higher in body fat, you start to aromatize more, and a greater percentage of the weight that you are adding will be geared more towards body fat. So it's not an ideal situation, especially if the idea is at some point or another to eventually get back down lean enough to compete on stage. Um, but you would still continue to grow new muscle. It just wouldn't look very favorable. Generic versus farm growth hormone. Man, if you can afford to like test the generics that you're getting blood work where like your IGF is showing that it's high. You send a kit off or a bottle of your generic growth off to like a Janoschick lab and it shows that it's legit, then why in the world would you pay 10 times the price for farm? So many enormous and impressive bodybuilders have talked about using generics. A lot of us are just using the same source, and um, that's my personal experience. I had long stretches where I used pharmacy only, and I wish that I could get my money back because it's no different. Now, of course, like people have get really cheap or really shitty generics or fake generics and then complain and say, like, generics suck. And it's like, well, no, your generics sucked. Um, Last one, why do some use low dose Tren in the off season? I personally, like with myself and with my clients, I very, very rarely do this. But I could see if you were someone that was in like a long off season and you really pushed up in terms of body weight and body fat. And within that same off season, you were going to do kind of like a pullback or a mini cut, something like that. Um, you could get pretty aggressive with how low you brought your calories, how high you brought your cardio to expedite that process of stripping body fat off and getting back to growing. Um, and in that process of being aggressive with the output and the calorie deficit, I could come up. I could see that being reason enough to use like a low dose trend, maybe something like 20 milligrams or 30 milligrams a day, like somewhere between 140 and 200, something like that. But it's not. I don't love doing it. I kind of um, people poked fun at bodybuilders that say stuff like this or classify drugs like this, but I view that as a contest prep drug. And I like the idea of saving certain drugs, Trend being one of them, as like an ace card for contest prep, where you haven't used it in a year or whatever the whole length of your off season was, and then when you put it in prep, you really get a response from it. So um, I think that's where I'm going to wrap it up, guys. Thanks for checking the video out. Like I said, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, send it to a friend, share it around, ring the bell so that you're notified. And yeah, until next time.